Hey all y'all, welcome back to my channel. My name is Carrie and this is episode 5 of Knitting Fundamentals. So far you've learned how to cast on, you've learned how to do the knit stitch, and hopefully you have practiced binding off. At this point, there is a lot of knitting that is available to you just by knowing how to do the knit stitch. This project that I'm wearing today is actually all garter stitch. However, until you learn the second stitch in knitting, the whole world of this craft isn't yet open to you. So that's what we're going to talk about today. If you haven't already, hit subscribe, hit the notification bell, and let's learn all about the purl stitch. When you first learn how to knit, you spend a lot of time getting comfortable just doing the knit stitch. And then you're feeling confident. You're like, oh, this is so comfortable. I feel so great. Knitting, I got it. And you're feeling really confident. And then suddenly you learn the purl stitch. And it can feel like you're right back at square one, feeling fumbly and awkward. And suddenly it's like, oh my gosh, what's happening? Why can't I do this suddenly? I want to assure you that feeling uncomfortable learning the purl stitch is completely normal. Here's the good news. You already feel comfortable holding your needles and moving them. You already feel comfortable with tensioning your yarn. So you are not, in fact, starting back at square one. You will totally master this stitch just like you're mastering the knit stitch. So be patient with yourself. Be kind to yourself as you're learning a new skill. So pep talk is over. And in today's video, I will be briefly going over the structure of the purl stitch. I will demonstrate how the purl stitch is done using both the traditional English style method and the Continental method, and then I'll teach you in detail how I do the purl stitch using lever knitting. As always, I have time code down below in the description box if you want to skip around to any part of the video. With all that said, let's purl. I'm going to let you in on a little secret about knitting. If you isolate one row of knitting, it is an undulation of yarn, right? Well, if I were to isolate a row of purl stitches away from all the others, you know what it would look like? The exact same undulation of yarn. So what's the difference between a knit stitch and a purl stitch if you're just creating that same wave of yarn? Well, the difference has to do with where that purl bump ends up on the fabric when you do a knit stitch versus a purl stitch. So to show you what I'm talking about, I am pulling out Mundo Swatch. Yes, I'm kind of in love with this giant little tiny bit of knitting. Okay, so as you now know, when you do a knit stitch, you have the yarn to the back of the work. You put your needle through the front of the leg to the back of the leg and pull a loop of yarn through. And the purl bump gets pushed to the back of the work. So the purl stitch is actually the mirror of the knit stitch. We're going to do everything in reverse so that we're pulling that purl bump towards us, towards the front of the fabric. So what does that mean? Well, in the knit stitch, the yarn is held to the back of the work. So in the purl stitch, the yarn is held to the front of the work. In the knit stitch, the needle is brought in front of the right leg and behind the left leg. So when we do the purl stitch, the needle comes behind the right leg, in front of the left leg, and then you pull that stitch through. And there is the purl bump that is now on the front of the work facing you. And if I were to turn this over, which I will do, here is that purl stitch I just did, and look, this is the purl stitch that I did. This is the stitch we worked into, and look, that looks an awful lot like a knit stitch. So that's what the purl stitch is. The purl stitch is pulling a loop of yarn from the front of the work to the back of the work, and that flips the purl bump towards you to the front of the fabric. But I just want to take note right now, again, just like I did with the knit stitch, notice the needle will always, for the purl stitch, to keep your stitches nice and open and untwisted, You're always wanting to have the right needle come behind the right leg and in front of the left leg. All right, so next let's look at how you actually accomplish the purl stitch using a pair of needles. So first I'm going to show you what the purl stitch looks like if you're doing a traditional English knitting method. So my yarn is to the front of the work, my needle, my right needle is behind my left needle, and I'm going to insert my needle behind the right leg so that it comes in front of the needle, wrap my yarn counterclockwise, and pull the stitch off. With English knitting, the big difference really is just how that needle is getting inserted into the stitch. Your hand is still doing the counterclockwise motion. It's just the yarn is to the front. The fact that in English knitting, how you throw the yarn using that counterclockwise motion with your hand is the same versus the knit stitch and the purl stitch is, to me, the big advantage of English knitting. I think having that same motion between the knit stitch and the purl stitch helps you have better even tension between your knit and your purl stitch, and it's easier to learn how to do the purl stitch because you're not doing a completely different motion like you do or can be doing with the Continental method. And let me show you that next. The way that I was taught to do the purl stitches: insert my needle, put it underneath the yarn like this, and then take my forefinger and push down on that yarn so it tensioned it and I could drag it through. So it's not exactly a picking motion. It's hard to pick the yarn, wrapping the yarn counterclockwise with Continental because there's nothing really tensioning that yarn. So you have to find a way to kind of push down. This is how I've kind of, in my own crazy way, tried to do it. That sort of works. I'm gonna be honest, I'm not the most proficient at doing Continental knitting this way with the purl stitch because I abandoned this method pretty early on when I was learning how to do Continental knitting. I do sometimes utilize Continental knitting and I still do purl stitches, but I utilize a method called combo knitting. Combo knitting is a much larger conversation than what I can really cover in this video, but the short explanation is, in combo knitting, when you do your knit stitches, you wrap the yarn counterclockwise, and when you wrap your purl stitches, you wrap the yarn clockwise. And when you wrap the yarn clockwise, your stitches end up in the eastern mount. The eastern mount is when the right leg is to the back of the needle and the left leg is to the front of the needle. Doing combo knitting is not difficult by any stretch of the imagination, but there's certainly things that you have to be aware of in terms of translating what are the usual directions you're given in knitting to how they apply to combo knitting. So anyway, like I said, it's a much larger conversation. We really don't have time for it today. Let's put all that to the side and get into the details of how we do the purl stitch with lever knitting. Yay, lever knitting, my home. I love you. Oh. If you haven't already, bind off what's on your needles right now and cast on 20 to 30 stitches so you can start practicing the purl stitch. Here's the good news. This video should be shorter than the episode 3 because with lever knitting, you hold your needles the same way, you tension your yarn the same way, so you don't need to get comfortable with that again. So yay! But we do have to get ourselves a little bit set up to do the purl stitch, and it's really easy. All you're going to do is make sure the yarn is to the front of the work. So you want to bring your right needle behind the working yarn, and then this is when I like to tension it. So position 1 for lever knitting is the left needle goes on top of the right needle, all right, like this, and the right needle is sitting to the right of the first stitch. That's going to set you up so the right needle goes behind the right leg and through the stitch. Now what you're going to do is move to position 2. To move to position 2, keep your needles touching and move the left needle away from you around the tip of the right needle and then back. And this is position 2, where now the right needle is sitting on top of the left needle and is through this stitch. So now we wrap the yarn, and we wrap the yarn by moving our hand counterclockwise around the needle. So the yarn is going to go kind of over the top of the right needle, underneath, and then over. But it's still moving your hand in a counterclockwise motion. Now I move my left needle back to position 1. So I'm going to move the needle away from me, around the tip of the right needle, back. Now I'm back in position 1 and out. That's all the purl stitch is. Now you'll notice when I was doing that purl stitch, I did kind of use my left hand to keep this needle a little bit more stable. Sometimes doing that first stitch on a cast on row, everything's a little unstable. So sometimes you need to kind of just give the needle a little bit of an aid when doing the purl stitch, but just the first 1 or 2. Let me do this one more time. My left needle is in position 1, so it's on top of the right needle. The tip of my right needle is to the right of the stitch on my left needle. I'm going to keep my tips touching and move the left needle away from me, around the tip of the right needle, and through the stitch and back. So now the left needle is in position 2. So the right needle is on top of the left needle and through the stitch. Now I can wrap my yarn. Notice how much easier it was to wrap my yarn that time. My needle stayed nice and stable. Now I'm going to move the left needle away from me and back and out. One thing to be aware of when you are purling, your right hand does have to travel a greater distance to wrap the yarn around the right needle than it does when you have to do the purl stitch. So when you're first doing this, you may find that you have to angle your right hand a little bit differently in order to get the yarn to catch around the right needle. I know when I was learning how to lever knit, that took me some time to figure out was to how to angle my right hand in order to get it to actually wrap around the needle. You might have to actually bring your right needle further through this stitch so that you can more easily wrap your yarn. All right, now I'm going to turn my needles, bring my empty needle over to my right hand. I'm going to duck it underneath the working yarn because I'm keeping my yarn tension, and I'm all set up to do my next row. At this point, what you need to do is just knit row after row of purl stitches until you get comfortable with it, just like you did when you were learning how to do the knit stitch. But there's something I want to point out. As you are knitting purl after purl after purl, you're going to look at your fabric and go, wait a minute, this looks like garter stitch. In fact, if you look here, I've only done a couple of rows. You can already tell it's kind of looking like garter stitch. You could call this reverse garter stitch because you're knitting every single row in purl stitch. But that doesn't mean that when you knit garter with all knit stitches and you knit garter with all purl stitches, that your result is exactly the same. The gauge that you would achieve with garter stitch doing all knit stitches and the gauge you achieve with purl stitch will most likely be different, because when you do your purl stitch, the yarn actually takes a longer path around the needle. So when you do a knit stitch, the yarn is already here at the back of the needle. So all you have to do is bring it underneath the needle and back around the top, and you've done your knit stitch. But if I do a purl stitch, I just brought my yarn to the front of the needle, like this. What happens is your yarn isn't back here. You have to bring your yarn to the back of the needle before you can bring it back underneath and around. So it's a slightly longer path. This bit of knowledge in terms of purl stitch versus knit stitch and that path that it takes is something not to worry too much about at the moment, but it's one of those little pieces of information that's good to kind of keep in the back of your head because it will come up later when you have times when you're trying to troubleshoot tension. That's something that we will cover in a later future episode, but it's just something I wanted to share with you now. So some of the problems that you may run into with learning to do the purl stitch are actually the same that you would run into when trying to do the knit stitch. One, it's very easy to accidentally capsize your stitch. So again, just make sure you're keeping your yarn down, and in this case, to the front of the needle. Another issue you can run into is an errant yarn over. And it happens because you have the yarn towards the back of the work and you go into purl and boom, look at that. I got an extra stitch there. So again, the key to avoiding the errant yarn over is making sure that you're keeping this yarn to the front of the work. Drop stitches obviously can happen when purling, and my advice is the same right now, which is to, if you accidentally drop a stitch, don't worry about it, put a stitch marker on it, and just keep purling. Because right now, all you really need to worry about is getting comfortable with purling. In a later video, we will be going over how to repair stitches and rescue stitches and make fixes to your mistakes, but it's just not something you need to worry about at the moment. You're just doing practice swatches. Guess what? You now have the foundation to learn everything else about knitting. It's true. Yes, there's all sorts of other skills and tools in your toolboxes and things to learn, increases, decreases, yarn overs, but everything else in knitting grows out of the knit in the purl stitch. And once you've got those two things down, I swear there's nothing that you cannot accomplish if you want to. At this point, I would love to have your feedback in terms of what you would like to see next in the Knitting Fundamental series. I'm going to leave a poll up here. And if you'd like to take part, great. If you have other ideas, please mention them in the comments below. But my thoughts at this point, I could do my next episode on knitting stockinette and ribbing. And that point, you would understand the three most basic fabrics in knitting, which are garter, stockinette, and ribbing. And so much of knitting is based on these three fabrics. Or I could do a video on fixing your mistakes, rescuing stitches, doing repairs. I also could do a video where you guys ask me a bunch of questions based on what we've already covered, and I try to answer them. There's a third idea. And idea number 4, do I have an idea number 4? I feel like I did, and it suddenly just like went right out of my head. Oh, and idea number 4 for the next video would actually be doing a video focused on getting good tension. Okay, like I said, I have a poll up here. Comment down below. If you want to find me on social media and let me know what you're thinking there, you can find all my social media in the description box below. Nice segue. As always, thank you for watching, and I hope that you have found this video helpful in your knitting journey. If so, please give it a thumbs up and share it with your friends. Let people know, hey, she is a good person to turn to if you want to hear about knitting, because I'm wanting to grow this channel. Also, if you haven't already, please subscribe and hit the notification bell, which will let you know whenever I upload a new video. As always, I hope you have a wonderful day, evening, weekend, weekday, weeknight, whenever you may be watching this. And as always, happy knitting. Bye. I hate the world right now. I recorded again without the audio. It's all right. It was just practice. Oh, God. There we go. Okay. Good. I'm gonna be fussing with this the entire day. All right, now we're ready. Now we're ready for the next segment. Ugh. Okay, I'm gonna be honest. I hate doing this with straight needles because the freaking desk is like they keep hitting the desk. I don't like. I'm knitting for straight needles, so this all looks very familiar to you if that's what you're working with. All right. I shouldn't say that. I almost said something that would have jinxed everything, and I'm not going to say it. Let's just get through the video. I don't want to jinx anything right now. Okay. Intro, 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 intro. I know my sound is on.